Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org, as well as the editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas+Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guest today is Dr. Michael Hanemann, the Chancellor's Professor and Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California Berkeley, where he's been on the faculty since 1968. He's also the Julia A. Wrigley Chair of Sustainability in the School of Sustainability in the College of Global Futures at Arizona State University. Michael has a BA from Oxford University in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and a Master's of Science in Economics from the London School of Economics, as well as a PhD in Economics from the University of Harvard. You're no slacker in terms of your academic credentials, Michael.
Well, I put off getting a real job.
Well, welcome, first of all, and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
It's my pleasure, Todd. It's great to be here.
So I read a number of your articles, and that's, what led me to contact you. And I read them during research I'm doing for an organization in Texas called Texas 2036, where I'm taking a look at water markets. And hope to have that study wrapped up and available to everybody at the beginning of the year. So let's start out, though, Michael, with your background in water. How did you first become interested in water?
Well, I grew up in Manchester in England, which, in addition to being very wet, was a 19th century water imperialist. So in around 1870, Manchester, whose population was growing, and it flooded a famous valley in the Lake District north to expand its water supply. And when I was 10 or something in school, our class was ushered to downtown to Manchester City Hall to see they have a replica of Manchester's water system, including the conveyance. So I was duly impressed. It was a little bit like, I think, a Roman schoolboy, from the provinces being taken to Rome to see the imperial buildings. But then I wound up at Berkeley having my dissertation was on measuring the economic damage from water pollution.
Okay.
Dealing with water, but not water supply. But I wound up getting a job at the University of California, and water is a big deal in California. So I decided to create a course on the economics of water around 1980. And I got completely engrossed.
So that's when you really started working with water markets at that time?
No, I started teaching the economics of water. And so water markets were an obvious topic. A major feature in the Western states, and probably Texas, is 75 or 80% of the water is used in agriculture, but agriculture is only a small fraction of the economy. And so, this question of how do we move water to urban uses is always in the background. But then through chance, I got asked to serve as the economic staff for California's Water Rights Agency. And I wound up getting involved in their decision process permitting water transfers from Northern California to Southern California. And that involved about 70 days of hearing. And as a staff member, I sat through the hearings, and when everybody else was done, the staff were allowed to ask questions. A theme of the hearings, particularly from some of the environmental representatives, was the need for water transfers. And the water rights, this was the fall of 86. And one theme was that in the drought in 76, 77, the Water Rights Agency had not been accommodating enough with proposed water transfers. And so a number of witnesses, academic colleagues, were chiding the agency for not doing more for water transfers. And they got pushback from other witnesses and from the water board itself, that there were complications which had blocked these transfers, which the sort of advocates of water transfers were unaware of. So they were oversimplifying. So one example was mentioned was there had been a proposed transfer of groundwater in the spring of 1977, in the sort of the height of the drought. And the Water Rights Agency delayed approving it and called for a report on how the transfer would affect the water table in that area. So they wanted a hydrologic study, and that was going to take time. And then the drought passed, and that didn't happen. And there were other things. So the point is, these were real-world complications, which, if you thought about them, had legitimacy. In other words, yes, if somebody wants to transfer groundwater and the neighbors are concerned that this will severely lower the water table, it's not unreasonable to ask someone to look into that.
Right.
So that was the striking thing to me. You had advocates of water transfers who had a point but were being simplistic. And that's when I first became aware of the underlying complications.
And you do a fantastic job of pointing out those complications in this article that you recently published, The Problems of Water Markets. And so, I read that, and, I said immediately, okay, well, this research I've been doing, over the last 9 months, I mean, this is, finally I read something that's telling me, I'm on the right trail because I keep seeing these same things. Yes. And so to me, it was kind of an aha moment when I read that. And I'm going to ask you some things about it specifically, but I do want to go back and touch on something. So, California is if you look at the state agency, it says about 80% of your water is going for ag. Texas, what I see here published is like 60, 65%, something like that. And so, the discussion is always, pretty much about, water being reallocated from agriculture to other uses. And the kind of the GDP issue always comes up with that as well. And boy, people are sensitive about that here. Really sensitive about it. And, I always think, it's not, when someone points out that, in California, 80% of the water is going to 3% of the GDP or something like that, they're really not saying agriculture is not worth it. That's really not the message, but I think there are a lot of people in the agriculture community who kind of, they get really concerned when they hear that. What's your thought?
That's understandable. And so the agricultural community, the agricultural sector is important, both economically and socially, and also culturally. This is part of our landscape, part of our history, and you want to keep it. In fact, what's happening now with the droughts we're experiencing is really the economic cost of water is rising, both for agriculture and for cities. And the pressure is going to come from affordability because cities can afford to pay much more. And that's going to be the challenge going forward. How do we make water available?
And that's why I've been, so interested in water markets. But let me just, this is kind of, I'm jumping forward to something I was going to talk about a little bit later. But, you point out in this paper, there's all sorts of confusion about the terms, water marketing, water markets. And I see that throughout the literature I've been reading. When I'm referring to a water market, I'm really thinking about something that's a structured closed system like the Edwards Aquifer, but that it may also be used by somebody else to describe a transaction that is not it's not is what is it in a really structured market for doing that. They occur, but it's I did an interview with a big water attorney here in Texas, and I said, well, what do you have to do to sell or transfer a water right? And he said, well, the first thing is you got to find one of the hydrologists who knows what's available and who wants water. And then the second is you have to hire a lobbyist. And I said, well, okay, now that, once you get to number two, it's hard to really think of it as a market in a lot of ways, but, the transactions are, they're complicated and there's so many steps and, and they're happening in non-structured environments that have all these issues that you're pointing out in this paper.
Yeah, the late great Joe Sachs, the environmental lawyer who, if there were ever a Nobel Prize in law, would have won it, and who revived the public trust doctrine. But he said a water market transaction is like a diplomatic negotiation.
Right.
You have the buyer and the seller. You have lots of other parties around who have an interest in that. And so it's not just two parties, it's multiple parties, multiple interests, and it's a diplomatic negotiation. And
so I have a
complexity.
I have a Joe Sachs story. So when I was getting my master's degree, I was going to the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources. And I had on my list, I wanted to take Joe Sachs' course over in law school. And I got there and he had just left. He just left the semester before. And I was like,
Yes, and wound up at Berkeley, to Berkeley's good fortune.
Right. So, so let's go ahead and kind of dive into some of what I was, finding in your article that I really would like to talk about. So, kind of your first, opening statement is water marketing and property right reform are intertwined. Water markets are advocated as a solution for water scarcity, but changes in water rights are often required in the scope of water marketing, if the scope of water marketing is to expand. Well, that's the Edwards Aquifer and the Rio Grande situation here in Texas. The water rights associated with those systems were, fundamentally changed. But that is a tough thing to do elsewhere, particularly where you've got surface water rights in the West and the prior appropriation system.
Water is an entangled resource, and it's entangled at the very least for two big reasons. One is return flows. How I use water, where exactly I apply it, will affect downstream flow to some degree. And if you're downstream of me, you care if I make a change and make some change in the return flow. And that's the fundamental distinction between water and land. You may be my neighbor. You may hate the color of my house or the architecture of my house, but it's like you can look in the other direction. And we have building codes But the interaction between how one piece of land is used versus another, it's regulated. I couldn't put a gas station next to my house. This is a suburban area. But we handle those interactions. With water, it's much more complex because of return flows. You and I, you're downstream of me, are sharing a resource in a way in which if we own two neighboring pieces of land, we don't share. The other difference is people's concern about water as a public resource and how other people use it. You could call it nosiness if you want. That's a somewhat pejorative term. But again, if I'm within a building code, I can build a funny house or paint it a funny color, and the city is going to let me do that. But if I stockpile water and don't use it because I want to speculate, that upsets a lot of other people. And so you're in a goldfish bowl when you use water to a degree that's not true with any other resource. And those are the two things. But because of return flows, because of the concern, because of the notion that in some sense water is a public resource and the public has an interest in it, those considerations have shaped the law. And the result is the legal property right in reflecting those things has ambiguities and elements that are undetermined. And that's what makes transferring a water right much more complicated than transferring any other type of property.
So just kind of, stepping away from, prior appropriation surface water rights, thinking about the Edwards, and I talk about the Edwards a lot because I, spent a lot of time on it. During that litigation, when I was working for Lucius Bunton, the federal judge who had those cases, there was a lot of concern and a lot of discussion about private property rights. And I kept hearing it over and over again from people, if this aquifer is regulated, my private property rights are going to be taken away from me. And I was like, okay, I guess I understand it. Then I thought about it more, and I wrote an article called The Little Fish That Roared. And I said in there, talking about the found article, right? And I said in there, look, there really weren't any private property rights under the rule capture, because somebody could buy a piece of property right next to you and drill a big well and suck out all the water. But now you've got a right from the Edwards Aquifer Authority that you can lease or sell or do whatever. I mean, so there's a lot of emotion that's also in fear wrapped up in all this about, people thinking they're going to lose out.
There's a book written by actually a writer who lives in California, but who grew up in Colorado. And the title is The Man Who Thought He Owned Water. And that captures the ambiguity. People feel they have or ought to have ownership interests, and it's very understandable why they feel that. And the man in question was the author's father, whom she adored. But the problem is you do have multiple people claiming an interest in water in a way in which you don't with land. I own this parcel, you own the one next to it. If you want to buy this parcel, okay, but you don't have, there's a limit to your interest. And as we said, I can't put a gas station on my land, but otherwise I'm allowed latitude. Water is inherently shared. In a way, it's shared for at least two reasons. One, if there's a shortage, if there's drought, all human beings need water to survive. And if we're farmers, we need water. So there's that notion. We ought to share water at a time of shortage with other human beings. And there's the return flow. The fact is that we're drawing from the same stream. And so we're literally interconnected. And that's the tension. We all have an interest for ourselves. We have an interest for other people and for the well-being of other people. and we all have interest in this same resource, and so we have to find a way of combining our interests, and that's the difficulty.
So you point out in your paper that water marketing really hasn't produced the long-term reallocation that was expected, and that most of the transactions really they're leases, and so they're short-term. But as we already discussed, the process associated with water rights and transferring them and is complicated and difficult and is impeding the reallocation part of it. The situation out there right now with the Colorado River, to me, I look at that and I keep thinking, well, I wonder if somehow that crisis is going to result in some fundamental change in water rights, at least related to the Colorado River and the Bureau of Reclamation. I mean, similar to what happened with the Evers Offer and the Lower Rio Grande, which, they were in a big water crisis, both of them, and they have a fundamentally different system. I'm, wondering, what do you think? Do you think the current crisis is going to lead to maybe something like that?
I think yes. But that's because the current crisis is so egregious. And what's egregious is not the drought, right? It's said that this is the most severe drought in the Southwest in 1,200 years, and that would be egregious. But what makes the Colorado egregious is they allocated 20 million acre feet, or thereabouts, when we never had 20 million acre feet. Maybe we had 15. And it's clear over the last decades, we've had 13 million acre feet. And going forward, we may have 11 million or 9. And so allocating 20 when you only have 15 or 13 or 11, that's the egregious thing. And that will force a process of changing the allocation, and it requires, well, let me put it this way. One way to change it is that's actually the crucial difference. One way to change it would be to ramp everybody down, but inherent in the allocation was, should I say, equity or politics, dividing the upper and lower basin states equally, and then within the lower basin, sort of dividing on the basis of seniority. I mean, de facto, with California, the oldest user getting the most preferential treatment.
That's right. The upper basin is handled differently in the lower basin.
Yes. And so sort of shrinking everybody proportionately, I mean, it may be the solution in the end, but it fundamentally breaks things because there are elements of seniority and history as the underlying basis for the allocation among the basins and particularly within the basins on the states. And you have to break that mold. You have to.
It's more of a correlative rights type of solution as opposed to prior appropriation.
Yes, yes. And of course, that's very difficult because it's difficult for two reasons. The people like California who have the strongest right want to retain a stronger right, the same degree of strength relative to the others, and the others aren't enthusiastic. But also it's kind of a change of mindset. And you still have water managers in the states pounding the table and saying, this is how we've always done things. History, seniority is in our DNA, is in our bloodstream. And that's a cry of pain. I mean, the other answer is, okay, go complain to Mother Nature or adapt, but pounding the table isn't isn't going to work. But that's the difficult process we'll go through. And that's why I think in the end, it will have to lead to doing something different and unprecedented.
So taking a step back, when you look at how that allocation was, what it was based on, if I think back to the 20s, I think, wow, that was really pretty progressive. I mean, they based it on stream flow measurements, right? But they just didn't have enough of them. I mean, they had a few years of them or decades, and it was kind of a wet period for sure, or definitely a wet period. And so when they divide it up, they found out later on, well, there's not nearly this much water most of the time. And so I almost feel like, gosh, that's kind of almost a case of, trying to use science to manage a river that comes back and bites you, but because you just didn't have enough data. And so what you thought might have been.
Well, there may have been more to it. So John Fleck and Kuhn wrote the book about 3 years ago, which argued that the science actually suggested less stream flow.
Okay.
The implication is they depending upon how you look at it, they probably allocated 18 million acre feet. They thought there was kind of 20, but they allocated 15 million acre feet. But there was always the question of Mexico, and there was always the question of evaporation. And so one interpretation is they were allocating 18, but they actually thought they had a margin because they thought there was 20. But as Fleck and Kuhn point out, there was some hydrologic analysis and reports suggesting 15 was actually what the existing record showed. It was a short record. And so another interpretation is they engaged in some wishful thinking. I mean, dividing up 18 or 20 is easier than dividing up 15. And so they took the easy solution and engaged in wishful thinking. Let me reframe this in another way. The feature of water rights. So it's very interesting to contrast the psychology of managing water in terms of water rights and managing water quality. Water quality really only became an issue after the Clean Water Act in 1972. Water quality is the province of the federal government. Water quantity is the province of the states, except on an interstate river. But I've always observed that the psychology is different. So with water quality, you can have a decision, but it's always a provisional decision. In other words, suppose you set a water quality standard for some pollutant. That's a decision. But if it turns out that the fish don't recover or other things go badly, you have to revisit the standard. You kind of can't say, we set a standard of X parts per million of, whatever. And if the fish don't like it, screw them. Water quality, the whole ethos is you are preserving a resource. You're the servant or the protector of certain resources. And so you have to tailor what you do, to the creatures for whom you're acting as trustee. You kind of can't just lay down the law and say, well, if the fish die, too bad. 17 parts per million is all they're getting. You have to at least consider doing something different. Water rights is more like an all-out battle. Think of a medieval battle. Mm-hmm. You and I we've argued for 50 years. We go before a judge. The judge says, Hanemann, you lose. Todd wins. Todd gets the chunk of water. And that battle is over. I will be unhappy, but I can't reopen and say, I can't come back 2 years later and say, now, it's not fair. So water rights was a kind of a winner take all, or at least it was a pitched battle. The issue was then resolved. There was no real. Whereas water quality, there could be reopeners because if circumstances change, you change. That mindset of a once and for all determination of a water right works if you have a static hydrology. But as we now know with climate change, we have a changing hydrology. And what I'm saying is that is a hard mindset to change, that we can't have a once and for all allocation of quantities of water. Right. And for 100 years or more, we sort of believed you could. And so that's part of the difficulty in the adjustment that we're going to have to make.
So there's something in your article that is a little bit different than what we've been discussing so far, but I wanted to talk about it because I read it and I was like, yes. I mean, this is a great parallel to something that I've been observing here in Texas. You talk about the difference between water and electricity. That their, economic characteristics are different. Electricity is helpful. Water is essential. You die without it. Electricity is man-made. Water's natural. Water infrastructure collects and distributes water, but it doesn't generate it. Electricity is hard to store, but easy to transport. Water is the complete opposite. And, there are a number of other elements that are different there. Now kind of thinking about oil and gas and coming back to Texas, there's a lot of let's put it this way. There are folks who have made a lot of money and done very well in the oil and gas industry who get involved with water. And, there are differences even there. I mean, it's not electricity, but there are more differences, between oil and gas and water than most people might understand. And it leads to some kind of difficult outcomes. And, I was looking at that and I was thinking, gosh, sometimes it can be kind of the same problem. The folks who might be, very familiar with electricity out west. I mean, a lot of these big dams are generating electricity and, really trying to apply a similar model to water. I hear all the time, we need a water grid in the United States. And, we're going to ship it back and forth between the East and West, and it's going to go up and down and all that. And I my eyes glaze over, but I'm just kind of curious.
It's not surprising. I'll talk about economists, my own field. We tend to place a lot of weight on theory and conceptual ideas, and much less on kind of walking around and seeing what happens on the ground. And so it's very natural to see analogies between electricity and water. Just to digress for a moment, water was kind of the sexy topic for economists. In the 1960s, 1950s, the field of the economics of water took off in the sort of mid-1950s and flourished for about 15 years. And famously,
is that mostly related to water quality, pollution, or is it?
No, it was before, and the context was, the Flood Control Act, of 1935, allowed the federal government allowed federal taxpayers' money to be used for flood control. As long as the benefits to whomsoever they accrued exceeded the costs. And that opened the gates to cost-benefit analysis. It opened the gates to federal projects, not all of which were well conceived, but it got the federal government, federal economists doing cost-benefit analysis. And by 1949, there was a feeling that things were out of hand. Different agencies were doing benefit cost analyses, and should we say, of different qualities. And so there was the view that the federal government needed to harmonize how it did benefit cost analysis, need to produce guidelines for doing benefit cost analysis. And that led to an interagency committee that produced a report called the Green Book on benefit cost analysis that came out in 1950 or 1951. And at that point, the view was economics could do benefit cost analysis for market commodities, basically calculating profit and loss. It couldn't value what we now call non-market commodities, human life and limb, recreation, pollution, those things. And the report literally said, these things are important, but economics can't handle them. But that had the ironic effect of interesting a number of economists. Otto Eckstein was an example, John Crutilla, who wrote books in the late 50s on the economics of water projects, and paved the way. And then really it's only a decade later that these concepts are applied to water pollution. So you have a flourishing of economics valuing, for example, recreation as a sort of commodity. Well, all that, the other thing was in the 60s, you had the extension of the California Water Project. The extension of the central, and a big debate. Hirschleifer, a very great microeconomist, wrote a book. Joe Bain wrote a book, leading figure in industrial organization. And, the theme of this was, rather than building infrastructure, you should use water more efficiently. And so, but the political decisions in 1960 and thereafter were, let's build projects, let's increase supply. And so the air went out of the field of water economics, that ballooned. And then by the late 60s and 70s, the field of energy economics arose. The French writers on electricity economics became known. And then from 1970 for the next 30, 40 years, if you were a bright young graduate student, energy economics was what you would look at. And so the field of energy economics, grew, is very successful. But here's the point. There's sort of a temptation to think, well, water is essentially similar in many respects to electricity, and so the sort of lessons learned for electricity work for water. And the problem is that's an oversimplification. And a new generation of economists interested in water is going to have to learn these differences which have been overlooked.
Right. So let's pivot from that to something about Western states and surface water rights, and their interest in surface water rights, and that this just kind of you've got this quote in here: the state shall determine in what way the water of the state, both surface and groundwater, should be developed for the greatest public benefit. That's not Texas, because Texas groundwater zone by the landowner, but this notion having to do with surface water rights applies here. And this is the thing that I always wonder about. That these very old surface water rights, they're, and to me, I know that the theory is that everybody in the state owns surface water, right? But once somebody gets a permit, or may have gotten a permit in 1900 for some surface water right, gosh, you don't really have, it seems like you have no seat at the table and looking at how they're using it. Should it still be used the same way? It's almost, I know it's a usufructuary right. it's not actually yours. You just got the right to use it. But boy, it sure is treated as if it is somebody's permanently, even though it's supposed to be the state's surface water. And so I'm always a little, concerned that how we treat surface water rights that are, especially older rights in states that don't have any environmental flow, requirements, any stream flow requirements, et cetera. But I mean, what do you think about that? Because I that seems like that's got to be at the crux of what you're writing about here, especially in the Western United States with prior appropriation.
There are different ways of looking at this, and this is basically. This is a value judgment. It also may be a legal judgment, depending upon what state law codes say. And I'm not a lawyer, but the way I think about this big picture is, in the end, there needs to be a sort of social compact or a social decision. These are natural resources, and Mother Nature is changing. How she does things is changing. Stream flow is changing temperatures and so on. So there are two extreme views. One is, well, we have property rights and live with them. So we have an interest in preserving ecosystems, that we didn't have 60 years ago. Fine, pony up the money. We're not changing rights. The other view would be, yes, that's understandable, but this is a changed situation. In a sense, this is a sort of catastrophe, and we're going to have to do something different. Let me make an analogy. If we have 10 foot of sea rise, if we have 6 foot of sea rise at some point, coastal land is going to become inundated. And, so the question is, what do we do? Well, one view is, you own coastal land and got flooded, you're out of luck. Another view would be, this is a societal problem and we need to help you in some way, we can't manufacture land, we can give you money to move or something. So this question of whether, nature changed, you're on your own, you're out of luck, versus no, the society has some interest in dealing with this. Those are 2 points of view. And it's becoming obvious, by the way, in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, that an issue, like that faces us now. The New York Times, I think yesterday or today, talked about many residents have lost their life savings, wouldn't be able to get insurance going forward. And so they are. That's permanently changed their lives. And the question is, do you say, well, that was your bad luck, can't be helped? Or, or should the state of Florida or the federal government do something to help? It's that same tension between those 2 points of view going forward with climate change. And, because the water supply is so essential, not only for human life, but for economies, sort of saying, well, people have to, take care of themselves is harder to say. There's another element, I think, which is relevant. We talk about water, but there's also the issue of water infrastructure. I mean, and this is very much an issue with Indian water rights that I've been involved with. It's not enough to get an allocation of water often. You need infrastructure to convey it, to transport it. And water infrastructure is very difficult to finance. It's capital intensive. It's very long lived. Capital, you can't finance it pay as you go because you need the whole infrastructure in place, and that's going to last for 100 years, but you can't deliver a single drop of water. And we, with infrastructure finance, we have a tradition of some sort of societal action. We have subsidizing federal water projects, subsidizing rural water supply infrastructure, whatever. And so we accept the notion of some sort of public obligation, some sort of obligation for the public to step up to the plate when we're thinking of financing infrastructure, or the conversation right now about affordability and all this. Maybe we can kind of harness that to the notion that there is some sort of social obligation and some need for social agreement with regard to the allocation of quantities of water. In other words, if we combine the societal interest in funding infrastructure with the question of should there be a societal interest in allocating water, maybe that will make things a little easier to accept.
One of the things that you and I also talked about when we talked a few weeks ago had to do with definitions like reasonable use and beneficial use. And so why don't you talk about reasonable use? I think, if you're talking about surface water rights in California, I guess, reasonable use is the definition that maybe, changing that a little bit might help out.
Yeah, and let me say, going back to Colorado in 1870, 1880, one notion was that people shouldn't speculate, shouldn't be allowed to get a water right just to speculate. Water should be put to use. But another notion was water that has to be put to a reasonable and beneficial use. This whole underlying notion that water is essential, but it's scarce, and we don't want people wasting it, and we don't want people sitting on it and not putting it to use. So there have been elements of the requirement that water has to be put to use. You can't just sit on it, but the use has to be, quote, reasonable and beneficial. Those notions go back to the 19th century. But for the longest time, you had to do something really over the top to be deemed not to be putting water to reasonable use. And a famous example was a farmer who flooded his fields to a depth of, I think, 3 foot because he wanted to kill gophers. He wanted to drown them, drown them dead. And that was judged to be a waste of water. But basically, reasonable use meant any normal use in agriculture or in if you look at this as a lexicographer and you ask what does the word reasonable, there would be overtones that what's reasonable depends on the circumstances and could vary with circumstances. That's not how reasonable use was interpreted in water law for a long time. But in the late 60s, there was a ruling in California involving water use in the Napa Valley. And the judge said there that what's reasonable at one point in time could stop being reasonable later on, that what's reasonable was relative to the circumstances. And that line of thought is slowly taking hold, but it's taking hold in California. And given California's very incomplete, very messy water rights, very screwed up water rights, and including repeated failures in trying to correct deficiencies in water rights, I think one way things may evolve is strengthening the definition of reasonable water use. So state agencies, courts may say, okay, in the drought of 2022 or in the drought of 2026, your using water for that purpose is not reasonable. I mean, if there weren't a drought, it's okay. And so that may become one way of regulating water use, but particularly in California, in a context where the state has no authority over half of surface water use because it was allocated before 1914, or even regulating groundwater, where it's not clear that anybody really has authority to regulate groundwater. So reasonable use is, I think, a compelling notion. I mean, the idea of getting serious about what's reasonable. And it may move forward in a way in which changing water rights remains deadlocked. Whether that's the best course or not, I don't know. But that may be where sort of something gives.
So just kind of, thinking about the situation in Texas, in the definition of beneficial use, almost anything is a beneficial use. I know the court case associated with it has a really extreme example and says, but it's still beneficial use. We also have cancellation. Water rights rarely are canceled. And so, I mean, the tools that are available, no one is really wanting to fully use or explore those. Sometimes it's so. I'm somewhat kind of torn about, well, if we make some of these changes, are they really going to result in what we want, or are you going to continue to have a situation where, well, they're really not being applied by the state, and so how much of a difference is going to be making?
Yeah, you see, the crucial problem is that water is not man-made. Now, you can desalinate water, and that is man-made, but it's still very expensive, not only in terms of capital, but also in terms of operating costs. And so as long as we can't manufacture water, we depend on water, as a society, as an economy. And if water supply is threatened, let's say by climate change, and we can't manufacture additional water, then the question is, isn't there a compelling societal interest in reallocating or changing certain uses or taking some sort of action? And that's what makes, water different, because at this point, it's not effectively, it can't be created by human beings. And so it's a limited resource.
Well, some of the examples of water markets, they're pretty clearly, they resulted from a crisis. And, the situation essentially got to where somebody had to do something. And, I hate to be a pessimist and think that that's how we're going to roll here, going forward. We're just going to we're going to make these big changes when the system crashes or whatever, however you want to phrase it. But it often it seems like that, we just go from crisis to crisis. We don't really, think ahead and try to, avoid some of these really thorny issues that no one ever really wants to weigh into.
No, these are difficult decisions because they involve consequences that are unpleasant for some or maybe many water users. And so wishful thinking, postponing things in the hope that this goes away, it's like sort of postponing surgery. You sort of hope that the need will go away and you don't have to go. But it's now become clear last year, this year with the droughts, it's finally dawned on many people, that this is not going to go away.
Right.
And so that's the sense in which taking these really unpleasant decisions, difficult decisions, is going to be forced on us. And it would be useful to start thinking about options ahead of time. Making major decisions in the midst of a full-fledged panic is a terrible idea. People are panicked, they're preoccupied, they're distracted, and you don't have time to sort through the alternatives. And so it really is incumbent on us to start thinking of pathways to change ahead of time.
So, this is just an observation based on the water markets I'm looking at here. But, what you see is the people who have surface water rights who in the Rio Grande, who now have correlative rights in that water market, and the folks who thought they had water rights but really didn't, the rural capture and the Edwards, who now have a groundwater right. I mean, they do very well. They really benefit financially from that once those systems are in place. And I often kind of wonder, if there was a way really to better communicate that, we're trying to create a system that, hey, you can, make money and do well and accomplish, these goals, which are important to everyone else in terms of the management of your water. And I don't know, and I'm probably being too Pollyannish about it, but I think sometimes, there's lots of fear about how you get there. They say, yeah, you might, okay, that looks good, but I'm afraid I'm not going to get what I think I deserve in my water rights, as you transition or you create this new system. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's very natural to be used to what you're used to and want to avoid changes. My wife will tell you, when we came to Phoenix, we rented a house, which was okay, but it turned out it was only available to rent for a year, and then we had to find the house we lived in. And I drove my dear wife crazy, saying, I'd like something like this house, which we've lived in for a year. We found a very different house, and I love it. But, I liked what I was used to. And all I'm saying is that's human nature, and some people may do that to a greater degree, and I may be one of them. But there are two arguments. One is, you'll be better off financially and in other ways if you make the change. The other argument is fear. This is just not going to work. Right. And you're going to be in bad shape if you don't make the change. And I think you need both arguments because we're moving to a situation where the amount of water we use is unsustainable.
Right. You need what I call an external forcing mechanism, an EFM.
Yes,
a judge or exactly. A drought or whatever.
It would be nice if we could keep doing what we're doing and not change. If that's my first vote, but at some point that is infeasible.
I really enjoyed this, and you've been great to talk to and patient, and talk to me before, which was really helpful for my research. So. Michael, why don't you tell us how listeners can find out more about the things you're doing, your work?
Well, I have a lot of writing ahead of me. I co-edited a special issue of a journal called the Oxford Review of Economic Policy that came out in the beginning of 2020. And I wrote a couple of papers there. I would like to write a book on the economics of water, actually 2 books, one for economists and one for lay people. And that's going to take, 3 years or so. But I would like to find a means of communicating both with economists and with non-economists what's going on. Economists don't understand the complexities. Non-economists don't understand the complexities. They also don't understand the economic angles which make water so difficult. And so I think there's really an obligation for those of us working on on water, you, me, and others, to try and educate people I mean, not in the sense of top down, but educate people to the complexities. Water is much more difficult than any other commodity. And so we need an understanding of the difficulties before we can make progress in finding good solutions.
I wish my wife could hear that last statement. She is a veteran of the electricity industry. And so I keep telling her this water stuff is a lot more complicated. And she's not convinced, but I agree with you. So, hey, Michael, this has been great. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Todd. I've enjoyed talking with you enormously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this has been Talk+Water. My guest today was Dr. Michael Hanemann, the Chancellor's Professor and Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California Berkeley. And he is also the Julie A. Wrigley Chair in Sustainability in the School of Sustainability in the College of Global Futures at Arizona State University. I want to thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. And I also want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk+Water ready to roll. My name is Todd Votteler. Let's talk water again soon.